I now want to say a little bit about the threat of buyer's bargaining power, one of Porter's 5 competitive forces. If we go back to Porter's model, let me just remind you the nature of this threat. So we're looking at things from the perspective of the firm that's thinking about its relationship with buyers. It's going to be concerned about, first, the price that the buyers are going to be willing to pay, but it also has to be worried, perhaps, about costs of production. As mentioned earlier, if the buyers are picky about quality, for example, and if they have a lot of power to demand a good quality product, that could also raise the firm's costs. So we need to think about both price and about costs. Well, I don't have to go into things in a lot of detail here, really, because the earlier examination of the relative power of suppliers vis-a-vis buyers, in this case where the firm was a buyer, all of those ideas really carry forward to this situation here where the firm is the supplier and we're thinking about its relationship with buyers. So there's a whole set of parallel ideas which I've summarized in some separate slides that I'm not going to record, but I'm just going to give you as kind of background notes in case those are helpful. Well, let's think of some of the factors that help influence buyers' bargaining power. Well, as I mentioned, the key ones are really the same ones that we saw when we thought about suppliers' bargaining power. So I spent a lot of time talking about the relative numbers of buyers and sellers. Effectively, that's really talking about the market structure that the buyers and the sellers find themselves in. We looked at the idea of how dependent is one party on another. In this case, we're concerned about how dependent is the firm on individual customers. Obviously, if the firm has many customers to which it can sell, then it's in a better bargaining position. If it's in a situation where it has just 1 or 2 very large customers, we would expect that they would have a lot of bargaining power. Another concept that we saw was switching costs. So how easy is it for the parties in the transaction to find somebody else to trade with? In this case, we'd want to think, how easy is it for the firm to find an alternative buyer? And we need to worry if the buyers could easily find someone else to supply them with what they wanted. Finally, we would need to think about threats of, in this case, backward vertical integration. So what that means is that the buyer could effectively enter our market, perhaps as a new firm or in conjunction with one of our rivals. Maybe it could merge with one of them, for example. Well, as I did before, we can summarize this in this matrix in which I just set out all the possibilities. I've provided this as a PDF, as a separate slide, just for your general reference. So I just remind you that not all the names of these kinds of market structures are in our reading, but I think it's worth knowing just what they are. I've also included a background set of notes just describing each of these market structures in a bit more detail. Well, one thing that's going to be important in thinking about buyer's bargaining power is just how the buyer would react to changes in the firm's price. We've already spent some time thinking about what determines the price elasticity of demand, what makes it large or small. And, excuse me, in this case, we've already seen this basic idea. If the buyer is spending a lot of their budget on our product, we would expect that they're going to be quite sensitive to changes in the price of that product. So if the firm were to attempt to raise its price, our buyers would have some incentive to go shopping around and perhaps look for another supplier. On the other hand, if the product that we're supplying to the buyer is not a large part of their costs, we might expect that they would not be as price sensitive. Just to give you a simple example, suppose that our buyer is in the business of selling poutine, that sort of pinnacle of Canadian cuisine. You probably are aware that poutine consists of French fries, gravy, and cheese, and probably some other stuff. Well, if the buyer is in the business of making and selling that, you would expect that a large part of their costs are going to go into, I suppose, labor, which I haven't mentioned here, but also materials like potatoes and the oil that they fry the potatoes in. But other things, maybe salt and pepper and some other small ingredients, might not be very important. So we would expect that the price sensitivity for these particular inputs would be large for these things, but perhaps small for something like salt. I mentioned the idea earlier of backwards vertical integration. So what that is saying is really the buyer can threaten to enter the firm's industry and in effect become a new competitor. So that really just raises the issues of the threat of entry of new firms that we thought about earlier in the course. Our buyer could have various options. It could enter the market itself. It could also buy or merge with an existing firm. Well, here's an example of the potential for backwards vertical integration. A long time ago, 30, 40 years ago, universities used to produce all of their own services, as I can remember. They used to hire their own cleaning staff. They had their own security people. Large universities like the University of Toronto actually has its own police force. They ran their own cafeterias with their own employees. They maintained their buildings. They owned their bookstores and so on. So they produced all those services themselves. Now, what's actually happened in the years since then is that universities have started to contract out those services. So instead of carrying out backwards vertical integration, they've sort of done the reverse of that and chosen to purchase things from individual suppliers. You might imagine, based on the reasoning that we've seen earlier in this lecture, that they may have done that because they could have thought that they could be reducing their costs. After all, if we think of the university as a large employer, a large firm, a large buyer in this case, there may be many services, cleaning businesses that could be offering these services and bidding against each other. And so perhaps the university could lower its costs that way. The same would go for other kinds of services So in fact, the University of New Brunswick has contracted out all of these services that I've mentioned here. Now, the threat of backwards vertical integration continues. So if any one of these services became too expensive, then the university could discontinue them and produce those services themselves. What other ideas should we think about here? You won't be surprised that the idea of product differentiation comes up yet again. If the firm is a seller, if it made a greater investment in making its product more differentiated from the competition, perhaps by advertising, branding, other kinds of marketing devices, or changing the nature of the product itself, it might make demand less elastic. Of course, less elastic demand on the part of the firm's buyers is going to increase the firm's market power. Let's just think of a simple example. Suppose that the firm was selling something like clothing to a large retailer, perhaps something like Walmart, that we would expect would have pretty high bargaining power. If the customers of a large retailer like that demanded our product, perhaps because of successful advertising and branding, then that would increase our bargaining power even with large retailers, because they would have to be paying attention to the preferences of their customers. What else? Well, again, there's the usual idea of switching costs. If it's difficult for buyers to find another seller, then our bargaining power is going to be higher. Just to think of an example, we could go back to the notion of tying. Buyer switching costs become quite high if you're able to fairly closely tie your product with some other service, which you are also offering. A rather unpleasant example that I came across that you may be familiar with is the way that Apple ties the use of its iPhones to its own services and perhaps some of its other products. I'm told that if you try to charge your phone with a charger that is not made by Apple, it may start to malfunction. If you break your screen, you won't be able to use your phone unless you get Apple to repair it. Otherwise, they will detect that you've used the competition, and apparently they will disable your phone. As I've mentioned before about switching costs, you have to expect that buyers are going to think about that before they lock themselves into the product in the first place. Well, this concludes all that I'm going to say about the relative power of buyers and sellers in markets. Finally, please have a look at my summary of the things that influence the relative power of buyers and sellers. I've written that summary so that it's extremely detailed. I've gone into every example that I can think of, and I've written it in a way that tries to illustrate how the reasoning in thinking about supplier power and thinking about buyer power is really symmetric. So if you understand the story of one, you'll also understand the story of another one.